Chapter 10 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. Go apart, Adam, and thou shalt hear how he will shake me up, as you like it. It is well known that even long before the immense regions of Louisiana changed their masters for the second, and, as it is to be hoped, for the last time, its unguarded territory was by no means safe from the inroads of white adventurers. The semi-barbarous hunters from the Canadas, the same description of population, a little more enlightened, from the States, and the Métis or half-breeds, who claimed to be ranked in the class of white men, were scattered among the different Indian tribes, or gleaned a scanty livelihood in solitude, amid the haunts of the beaver and the bison, or, to adopt the popular nomenclature of the country, of the buffalo. Footnote: in addition to the scientific distinctions which mark the two species, it may be added, with due deference to Dr. Battius, that a much more important particular is the fact, that while the former of these animals is delicious and nourishing food, the latter is scarcely edible. It was, therefore, no unusual thing for strangers to encounter each other in the endless wastes of the West. By signs, which an unpractised eye would pass unobserved, these borderers knew when one of his fellows was in his vicinity, and he avoided or approached the intruder as best comported with his feelings or his interest. Generally, these interviews were pacific, for the whites had a common enemy to dread, in the ancient and perhaps more lawful occupants of the country. But instances were not rare, in which jealousy and cupidity has caused them to terminate in scenes of the most violent and ruthless treachery. The meeting of two hunters on the American desert, as we find it convenient sometimes to call this region, was consequently somewhat in the suspicious and wary manner in which two vessels draw together in the sea that is known to be infested with pirates. While neither party is willing to betray its weakness by exhibiting distrust, neither is disposed to commit itself by any acts of confidence from which it may be difficult to recede. Such was, in some degree, the character of the present interview. The stranger drew nigh deliberately, keeping his eyes steadily fastened on the movements of the other party, while he purposely created little difficulties to impede an approach which might prove too hasty. On the other hand, Paul stood playing with the lock of his rifle, too proud to let it appear that three men could manifest any apprehension of a solitary individual, and yet too prudent to omit entirely the customary precautions. The principal reason of the marked difference which the two legitimate proprietors of the banquet made in the receptions of their guests was to be explained by the entire difference which existed in their respective appearances. While the exterior of the naturalist was decidedly pacific, not to say abstracted, that of the newcomer was distinguished by an air of vigour, and a front and step which it would not have been difficult to have at once pronounced to be military. He wore a forage cap of fine blue cloth, from which depended a soiled tassel in gold, and which was nearly buried in a mass of exuberant, curling, jet-black hair. Around his throat he had negligently fastened a stock of black silk. His body was enveloped in a hunting shirt of dark green, trimmed with the yellow fringes and ornaments that were sometimes seen among the border troops of the Confederacy. Beneath this, however, were visible the collar and lapels of a jacket similar in colour and cloth to the cap. His lower limbs were protected by buckskin leggings, and his feet by the ordinary Indian moccasins. A richly ornamented and exceedingly dangerous straight dirk was stuck in a sash of red silk network. Another girdle, or rather belt, of uncoloured leather, contained a pair of the smallest sized pistols, in holsters nicely made to fit, and across his shoulder was thrown a short, heavy, military rifle, its horn and pouch occupying the usual places beneath his arms. At his back he bore a knapsack, marked by the well-known initials that have since gained for the government of the United States the good-humoured and quaint appellation of Uncle Sam. "I come in amity," the stranger said, like one too much accustomed to the sight of arms, to be startled at the ludicrously belligerent attitude which Dr. Battius had seen fit to assume. "I come as a friend, and am one whose pursuits and wishes will not at all interfere with your own." "Harkee, stranger," said Paul Hover bluntly, Do you understand lining a bee from this open place into a wood, distant perhaps a dozen miles?" "The bee is a bird I have never been compelled to seek," returned the other laughing, "though I have, too, been something of a fowler in my time." "I thought as much!" exclaimed Paul, thrusting forth his hand frankly, and with the true freedom of manner that marks an American border. "Let us cross our fingers. You and I will never quarrel about the comb, since you set so little store by the honey. And now, if your stomach has an empty corner, and you know how to relish a genuine dewdrop when it falls into your very mouth, there lies the exact morsel to put into it. Try it, stranger; and having tried it, if you don't call it as snug a fit as you may have since, how long are you from the settlements, pray?" "'Tis many weeks, and I fear it may be as many more before I can return. I will, however, gladly profit by your invitation, for I have fasted since the rising of yesterday's sun, and I know too well the merits of a bison's bump to reject the food." "Ah! you're acquainted with the dish? Well, therein you have the advantage of me, in setting out, though I think I may say we could now start on equal ground. I should be the happiest fellow between Kentucky and the Rocky Mountains, if I had a snug cabin, near some old wood that was filled with hollow trees, just such a hump every day as that for dinner, a load of fresh straw for hives, and "Little what?" demanded the stranger, evidently amused with the communicative and frank disposition of the bee hunter. "Something that I shall have one day, and which concerns nobody so much as myself," returned Paul, picking the flint of his rifle, and beginning very cavalierly to whistle an air well known in the waters of the Mississippi. During this preliminary discourse the stranger had taken his seat by the side of the hump, and was already making a serious inroad on its relics. Dr. Battius, however, watched his movements with a jealousy still more striking than the cordial reception which the open-hearted Paul had just exhibited. But the doubts, or rather apprehensions, of the naturalist were of a character altogether different from the confidence of the bee hunter. He had been struck with the stranger's using the legitimate instead of the perverted name of the animal off which he was making his repast, and as he had been among the foremost himself to profit by the removal of the impediments which the policy of Spain had placed in the way of all explorers of her transatlantic dominions, whether bent on the purposes of commerce, or, like himself, on the more laudable pursuits of science, he had a sufficiency of every-day philosophy to feel that the same motives, which had so powerfully urged himself to his present undertaking, might produce a like result on the mind of some other student of nature. Here then was the prospect of an alarming rivalry, which bade fair to strip him of at least a moiety of the just rewards of all his labours, privations, and dangers. Under these views of his character, therefore, it is not at all surprising that the native meekness of the naturalist's disposition was a little disturbed, and that he watched the proceedings of the other with such a degree of vigilance as he believed best suited to detect his sinister designs. "This is truly a delicious repast," observed the unconscious young stranger, for both young and handsome he was fairly entitled to be considered. "Either hunger has given a peculiar relish to the viand, or the bison may lay claim to the finest of the ox family." "Naturalists, sir, are apt, when they speak familiarly, to give the cow the credit of the genus," said Dr. Battius, swelling with secret distrust, and clearing his throat before speaking, much in the manner that a duellist examines the point of the weapon he is about to plunge into the body of his foe. "The figure is more perfect, as the bos, meaning the ox, is unable to perpetuate his kind, and the bos, in its most extended meaning, or vaca, is altogether the nobler animal of the two." The doctor uttered this opinion with a certain air, that he intended should express his readiness to come at once to any of the numerous points of difference which he doubted not existed between them, and he now awaited the blow of his antagonist, intending that his next thrust should be still more vigorous. But the young stranger appeared much better disposed to partake of the good cheer, with which he had been so providentially provided, than to take up the cudgels of argument on this, or on any other of the knotty points which are so apt to furnish the lovers of science with the materials of a mental joust. "I dare say you are very right, sir," he replied, with a most provoking indifference to the importance of the points he conceded. "I dare say you are quite right, and that vaca would have been the better word." "Pardon me, sir, you are giving a very wrong construction to my language, if you suppose I include, without many and particular qualifications, the bibulus americanus in the family of the vaca. For, as you well know, sir, or as I presume I should say, doctor, you have the medical diploma, no doubt?" "You give me credit for an honour I cannot claim," interrupted the other. "An undergraduate? Or perhaps your degrees have been taken in some other of the liberal sciences?" "Still wrong, I do assure you." "Surely, young man, you have not entered on this important, I may say this awful service, without some evidence of your fitness for the task? Some commission by which you can assert an authority to proceed, or by which you may claim an affinity and a communion with your fellow workers in the same beneficent pursuits." "I know not by what means or for what purposes you have made yourself master of my objects," exclaimed the youth, reddening and rising with a quickness which manifested how little he regarded the grosser appetites, when a subject nearer his heart was approached. "Still, sir, your language is incomprehensible. That pursuit, which in another might perhaps be justly called beneficent, is in me a dear and cherished duty; though why a commission should be demanded or needed is, I confess, no less a subject of surprise." "It is customary to be provided with such a document," returned the doctor gravely, "and, on all suitable occasions, to produce it, in order that congenial and friendly minds may, at once, reject unworthy suspicions, and stepping over what may be called the elements of discourse, come at once to those points which are desiderata to both." "It is a strange request," the youth muttered, turning his frowning eye from one to the other, as if examining the characters of his companions, with a view to weigh their physical powers. Then, putting his hand into his bosom, he drew forth a small box, and extending it with an air of dignity towards the doctor, he continued, "You will find by this, sir, that I have some right to travel in a country which is now the property of the American States." "What have we here?" exclaimed the naturalist, opening the folds of a large parchment. "Why, this is the sign manual of the philosopher Jefferson, the seal of state, countersigned by the minister of war. Why, this is a commission creating Duncan Uncas Middleton a captain of artillery." "Of whom? Of whom?" repeated the trapper, who had sat regarding the stranger, during the whole discourse, with eyes that seemed greedily to devour each lineament. "How is the name? Did you call him Uncas? Uncas? Was it Uncas?" "Such is my name," returned the youth, a little haughtily. "It is the appellation of a native chief, that both my uncle and myself bear with pride, for it is the memorial of an important service done my family by a warrior in the old wars of the provinces." "Uncas? Did he call him Uncas?" repeated the trapper, approaching the youth, and parting the dark curls which clustered over his brow, without the slightest resistance on the part of their wondering owner. "Ah, my eyes are old, and not so keen as when I was a warrior myself, but I can see the look of the father in the son. I saw it when he first came nigh, but not so many things have since passed before my falling sight, that I could not name the place where I had met his likeness. Tell me, lad, by what name is your father known?" "He was an officer of the States in the war of the Revolution. Of my own name, of course. My mother's brother was called Duncan Uncas Hayward." "Still Uncas? Still Uncas?" echoed the other, trembling with eagerness. "And his father?" "Was called the same, without the appellation of the native chief. It was to him and to my grandmother that the service of which I have just spoken was rendered." "I know'd it, I know'd it," shouted the old man in his tremulous voice, his rigid features working powerfully, as if the names the other mentioned awakened some long dormant emotions, connected with the events of an anterior age. "I know'd it. Son or grandson, it is all the same. It is the blood, and 'tis the look. Tell me, is he they call Duncan, without the Uncas, is he living?" The young man shook his head sorrowfully, as if he replied in the negative. "He died full of days and of honours, beloved, happy, and bestowing happiness." "Full of days?" repeated the trapper, looking down at his own meagre, but still muscular hands. "Ah, he lived in the settlements, and was wise only after their fashions. But you have often seen him, and you have heard him discourse of Uncas, and of the wilderness." "Often. He was then an officer of the king, but when the war took place between the crown and her colonies, my grandfather did not forget his birthplace, but threw off the empty allegiance of names, and was true to his proper country. He fought on the side of liberty." "There was a reason in it, and what is better, there was nature. Come, sit ye down beside me, lad. Sit ye down, and tell me of what your grandfather used to speak when his mind dwelt on the wonders of the wilderness." The youth smiled, no less at the importunity than at the interest manifested by the old man. but as he found there was no longer the least appearance of any violence being contemplated, he unhesitatingly complied. "Give it all to the trapper by rule and by figures of speech," said Paul, very coolly taking his seat on the other side of the young soldier. "It is the fashion of old age to relish these ancient traditions, and for that matter I can say that I don't dislike to listen to them myself." Middleton smiled again, and perhaps with a slight air of derision, but, good-naturedly turning to the trapper, he continued. "It is a long, and might prove a painful story. Bloodshed, and all the horrors of Indian cruelty and of Indian warfare are fearfully mingled in the narrative." "Ay, give it all to us, stranger," continued Paul. "We are used to these matters in Kentuck, and I must say I think a story none of the worse for having a few scalps in it." "But he told you of Uncas, did he?" resumed the trapper, without regarding the slight interruptions of the bee hunter, and which amounted to no more than a sort of by-play. "And what thought he and said he of the lad in his parlour, with the comforts and ease of the settlements at his elbow?" "I doubt not he used a language similar to that he would have adopted in the woods, and had he stood face to face with his friend." "Did he call the savage his friend? The poor naked painted warrior! He was not too proud then to call the Indian his friend?" "He even boasted of the connection, and as you have already heard, bestowed a name on his firstborn, which is likely to be handed down as an heirloom among the rest of his descendants." "It was well done. Like a man, ay, and like a Christian too. He used to say the Delaware was swift of foot. Did he remember that?" "As the antelope. Indeed, he often spoke of him by the appellation of Le Cerf Agile, a name he had obtained by his activity." "And bold and fearless lad?" continued the trapper, looking up into the eyes of his companion, with a wistfulness that bespoke the delight he received in listening to the praises of one, whom it was so very evident he had once tenderly loved. "Brave as a blooded hound, without fear. He always quoted Uncas and his father, who from his wisdom was called the Great Serpent, as models of heroism and constancy." "He did them justice. He did them justice. Truer men were not to be found in tribe or nation, be their skins of what colour they might. I see your grandfather was just, and did his duty, too, by his offspring. 'Twas a perilous time he had of it, among them hills, and nobly did he play his own part. Tell me, lad, or officer, I should say, since officer you be, was this all?" "Certainly not. It was, as I have said, a fearful tale, full of moving incidents and memories both of my grandfather and of my grandmother." "Ah!" exclaimed the trapper, tossing a hand into the air, as his whole countenance lighted with the recollections the name revived. "They called her Alice, Elise, or Alice, 'tis all the same. A laughing, playful child she was, when happy and tender and weeping in her misery. Her hair was shining and yellow as the coat of the young fawn, and her skin clearer than the purest water that drips from the rock. Well do I remember her. I remember her right well." The lip of the youth slightly curled, and he regarded the old man with an expression, which might easily have been construed into a declaration that such were not his own recollections of his venerable and revered ancestor, though it would seem he did not think it necessary to say as much in words. He was content to answer— "They both retained impressions of the dangers they had passed, but far too vivid easily to lose the recollection of any of their fellow actors." The trapper looked aside, and seemed to struggle with some deeply innate feeling. Then, turning again towards his companion, though his honest eyes no longer dwelt with the same open interest as before on the countenance of the other, he continued— "Did he tell you of them all? Were they all redskins, but himself and the daughters of Monroe?" "No. There was a white man associated with the Delawares, a scout of the English army, but a native of the provinces." "A drunken, worthless vagabond, like most of his colour who harbour with the savages, I warrant you." "Old man, your grey hairs should caution you against slander. The man I speak of was of great simplicity of mind, but of sterling worth. Unlike most of those who live a border life, he united the better, instead of the worse, qualities of the two people. He was a man endowed with the choicest and perhaps rarest gift of nature, that of distinguishing good from evil. His virtues were those of simplicity, because such were the fruits of his habits, as were indeed his very prejudices. In courage he was the equal of his red associates; in warlike skill, being better instructed, their superior. In short, he was a noble shoot from the stock of human nature, which never could attain its proper elevation and importance for no other reason than because it grew in the forest. Such, old hunter, were the very words of my grandfather, when speaking of the man you imagine so worthless." The eyes of the trapper had sunk to the earth, as the stranger delivered this character in the ardent tones of generous youth. He played with the ears of his hound, fingered his own rustic garment, and opened and shut the pan of his rifle, with hands that trembled in a manner that would have implied their total unfitness to wield the weapon. When the other had concluded, he hoarsely added, "Your grandfather didn't then entirely forget the white man?" "So far from that, there are already 3 among us, who have also names derived from that scout." "A name, did you say?" exclaimed the old man, starting. "What! the name of the solitary, unlearned hunter? Do the great, and the rich, and the honoured, and what is better still, the just, do they bear his very actual name?" "It is borne by my brother and by 2 of my cousins, whatever may be their titles, to be described by the terms you have mentioned." "Do you mean the actual name itself, spelled with the very same letters, beginning with an N and ending with an L?" "Exactly the same," the youth smilingly replied. "No, no, we have forgotten nothing that was his. I have at this moment a dog brushing a deer, not far from this, who is come of a hound that very scout sent as a present after his friends, and which was of the stock he always used himself. A truer breed, in nose and foot, is not to be found in the wide Union." "Hector," said the old man, struggling to conquer an emotion that nearly suffocated him, and speaking to his hound in the sort of tones he would have used to a child, "do you hear that, pup? Your kin and blood are in the prairies. A name, it is wonderful, very wonderful." Nature could endure no more. Overcome by a flood of unusual and extraordinary sensations, and stimulated by tender and long dormant recollections, strangely and unexpectedly revived, the old man had just self-command enough to add, in a voice that was hollow and unnatural through the efforts he made to command it, "Boy, I am that scout. A warrior once, a miserable trapper now." When the tears broke over his wasted cheeks, out of fountains that had long been dried, and, sinking his face between his knees, he covered it decently with his buckskin garment, and sobbed aloud. The spectacle produced correspondent emotions in his companions. Paul Hover had actually swallowed each syllable of the discourse, as they fell alternately from the different speakers, his feelings keeping equal pace with the increasing interest of the scene. Unused to such strange sensations, he was turning his face on every side of him, to avoid he knew not what, until he saw the tears and heard the sobs of the old man, when he sprang to his feet, and grappling his guest fiercely by the throat, he demanded by what authority he had made his good companion weep. A flash of recollection crossing his brain at the same instant, he released his hold, and stretching forth an arm in the very wantonness of gratification, he seized the Doctor by the hair, which instantly revealed its artificial formation, by cleaving to his hand, leaving the white and shining poll of the naturalist with a covering no warmer than the skin. "What think you of that, Mr. Bug-gatherer?" he rather shouted than cried. "Is not this a strange bee to line into his hole?" "'Tis remarkable, wonderful, edifying," returned the lover of nature, good-humouredly recovering his wig, with twinkling eyes and a husky voice. "'Tis rare and commendable, though I doubt not in the exact order of causes and effects." With this sudden outbreaking, however, the commotion instantly subsided, the 3 spectators clustering around the trapper with a species of awe, at beholding the tears of one so aged. "It must be so, or how could he be so familiar with a history that is little known beyond my own family?" at length the youth observed, not ashamed to acknowledge how much he had been affected by unequivocally drying his own eyes. "True!" echoed Paul. "If you want any more evidence, I will swear to it. I know every word of it myself to be true as the gospel." "And yet we had long supposed him dead," continued the soldier. "My grandfather had filled his days with honour, and he had believed himself the junior of the 2.
"It is not often that youth has the opportunity of thus looking down on the weakness of age,"
the trapper observed, raising his head, and looking around him with composure and dignity.
That I am still here, young man, is the pleasure of the Lord, who has spared me until I have seen fourscore long and laborious years, for his own secret ends. That I am the man I say, you need not doubt, for why should I go to my grave with so cheap a lie in my mouth?"
"I do not hesitate to believe. I only marvel that it should be so. But why do I find you, venerable and excellent friend of my parents, in these wastes, so far from the comforts and safety of the lower country?"
"I have come into these plains to escape the sound of the axe, for here surely the chopper can never follow. But I may put the like question to yourself. Are you of the party which the States have sent into their new purchase, to look after the nature of the bargain they have made?"
"I am not. Louis is making his way up the river, some hundreds of miles from this. I come on a private adventure."
"Though it is no cause of wonder, that a man whose strength and eyes have failed him as a hunter, should be seen nigh the haunts of the beaver, using a trap instead of a rifle, it is strange that one so young and prosperous, and bearing the commission of the Great Father, should be moving among the prairies without even a camp colourman to do his biddings."
"You would think my reasons sufficient did you know them, as know them you shall if you are disposed to listen to my story. I think you all honest, and men who would rather aid than betray on bent unworthy object."
"Come, then, and tell us at your leisure,"
said the trapper, seating himself and beckoning to the youth to follow his example. The latter willingly complied, and after Paul and the Doctor had disposed of themselves to their several likings, the new comer entered into a narrative of the singular reasons which had led him so far into the deserts. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. So foul a sky clears not without a storm. King John. In the meantime the industrious and irreclaimable hours continued their labours. The sun, which had been struggling through such masses of vapour throughout the day, fell slowly in a streak of clear sky, and thence sunk gloriously into the gloomy waste, as he is wont to settle into the waters of the ocean. The vast herds which had been grazing among the wild pastures of the prairies gradually disappeared, and the endless flocks of aquatic birds, that were pursuing their customary annual journey from the virgin lakes of the north towards the Gulf of Mexico, ceased to fan that air, which had now become loaded with dew and vapour. In short, the shadows of night fell upon the rock, adding the mantle of darkness to the other dreary accompaniments of the place. As the light began to fail, Esther collected her younger children at her side, and placing herself on a projecting point of her insulated fortress, she sat patiently awaiting the return of the hunters. Ellen Wade was at no great distance, seeming to keep a little aloof from the anxious circle, as if willing to mark the distinction which existed in their characters. "Your uncle is, and always will be, a dull calculator, Nell," observed the mother, after a long pause in a conversation that had turned on the labours of the day. "A lazy hand at figures and foreknowledge is that said Ishmael Bush. Here he sat lolloping about the rock from light till noon, doing nothing but scheme, 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 with 7 as noble boys at his elbows as woman ever gave to man, and what's the upshot? Why, night is setting in, and his needful work not yet ended." "Is it not prudent, certainly, aunt?" Ellen replied, with a vacancy in her air that proved how little she knew what she was saying. "And is it setting a very bad example to his sons?" "Hoity-toity, girl! Who has reared you up as a judge over your elders? I, and your betters, too. I should like to see the man on the whole frontier who sets a more honest example to his children than this same Ishmael Bush. Show me, if you can, Miss Fault-finder, but not fault-mender, a set of boys who will, on occasion, sooner chop a piece of logging and dress it for the crop, than my own children, though I say it myself, who perhaps should be silent, or a cradler that knows better how to lead a gang of hands through the field of wheat, leaving a cleaner stubble in his track than my own good man. Then, as a father, he is as generous as a lord, for his sons have only to name the spot where they would like to pitch, and he gives them a deed of the plantation, and no charge for papers is ever made." As the wife of the squatter concluded, she raised a hollow, taunting laugh, and was echoed from the mouths of several juvenile imitators, whom she was training to a life as shiftless and lawless as her own, but which, notwithstanding its uncertainty, was not without its secret charms. "Hola, old Esther!" shouted the well-known voice of her husband from the plain beneath. "Are you keeping your junkets, while we are finding you in venison and buffalo beef? Come down, old girl, with all your young, and lend us a hand to carry up the meat. Why, what frolic you are in, woman! Come down, for the boys are at hand, and we have work here for double your number." Ishmael might have spared his lungs more than a moiety of the effort they were compelled to make in order that he should be heard. He had hardly uttered the name of his wife, before the whole of the crouching circle rose in a body, and tumbling over each other, they precipitated themselves down the dangerous passes of the rock with ungovernable impatience. Esther followed the young fry with a more measured gait, nor did Ellen deem it wise, or rather discreet, to remain behind. Consequently the whole were soon assembled at the base of the citadel, on the open plain. Here the squatter was found, staggering under the weight of a fine fat buck, attended by one or two of his younger sons. Abiram quickly appeared, and before many minutes had elapsed, most of the hunters dropped in, singly and in pairs, each man bringing with him some fruits of his prowess in the field. "The plain is free from redskins, to night, at least," said Ishmael, after the bustle of reception had a little subsided, "for I have scoured the prairie for many long miles, on my own feet, and I call myself a judge of the print of an Indian moccasin. So, old woman, you can give us a few steaks of the venison, and then we will sleep on the day's work." "I'll not swear that there are no savages near us," said Abiram. "I, too, know something of the trail of a red-skin, and unless my eyes have lost some of their sight, I would swear, boldly, that there are Indians at hand. But wait till Asa comes in. He passed at the spot where I found the marks, and the boy knows something of such matters too." "Ay, the boy knows too much of many things," returned Ishmael gloomily. "It will be better for him when he thinks he knows less. But what matters it, Hetty, if all the Sioux tribes, west of the big river, are within a mile of us? They will find it no easy matter to scale this rock in the teeth of 10 bold men." "Call 'em 12 at once, Ishmael; call 'em 12, cried his termagant assistant, "for if your moth-gathering, bug-hunting friend can be counted a man, I beg you will set me down as 2. I will not turn my back to him with the rifle or the shotgun; and for courage, the yearling heifer, that them skulking devils the Tetons stole, was the biggest coward amongst us all, and after her came the drivelling doctor. Ah, Ishmael, you rarely attempt a regular trade but you come out the loser, and this man, I reckon, is the hardest bargain among them all. Would you think it? The fellow ordered me a blister around my mouth, because I complained of a pain in the foot." "It is a pity, Esther," the husband coolly answered, "that you did not take it. I reckon it would have done considerable good. But, boys, if it should turn out as Abiram thinks, that there are Indians near us, we may have to scamper up the rock, and lose our suppers after all. Therefore we will make sure of the game, and talk over the performances of the doctor when we have nothing better to do." The hint was taken, and in a few minutes the exposed situation in which the family was collected was exchanged for the more secure elevation of the rock. Here Esther busied herself, working and scolding with equal industry, until the repast was prepared, when she summoned her husband to his meal in a voice as sonorous as that with which the Imam reminds the faithful of a more important duty. When each had assumed his proper and customary place around the smoking viands, the squatter set the example by beginning to partake of a delicious venison steak, prepared like the hump of the bison, with a skill that rather increased than concealed its natural properties. A painter would gladly have seized the moment to transfer the wild and characteristic scene to the canvas. The reader will remember that the citadel of Ishmael stood insulated, lofty, ragged, and nearly inaccessible. A bright flashing fire that was burning on the centre of its summit, and around which the busy group was clustered, lent it the appearance of some tall Pharaohs placed in the centre of the deserts, to light such adventurers as wandered through their broad waste. The flashing flame gleamed from one sunburnt countenance to another, exhibiting every variety of expression, from the juvenile simplicity of the children, mingled as it was with a shade of the wildness peculiar to their semi-barbarous lives, to the dull and immovable apathy that dwelt on the features of the squatter when unexcited. Occasionally a gust of wind would fan the embers, and as a brighter light shot upwards, the little solitary tent was seen as it were suspended in the gloom of the upper air. All beyond was enveloped, as usual at that hour, in an impenetrable body of darkness.
"It is unaccountable that Asa should choose to be out of the way at such a time as this,"
Esther pettishly observed.
"When all is finished and to rights, we shall have the boy coming up, grumbling for his meal, and hungry as a bear after his winter's nap. His stomach is as true as the best clock in Kentucky, and seldom wants winding up to tell the time, whether of day or night. A desperate eater is Asa, when a-hungered by a little work."
Ishmael looked sternly around the circle of his silent sons, as if to see whether any among them would presume to say aught in favour of the absent delinquent. But now, when no exciting causes existed to arouse their slumbering tempers, it seemed to be too great an effort to enter on the defence of their rebellious brother. Abiram, however, who, since the pacification, either felt or affected to feel a more generous interest in his late adversary, saw fit to express an anxiety to which the others were strangers. "It will be well if the boy has escaped the Tetons," he muttered. "I should be sorry to have Asa, who is one of the stoutest of our party, both in heart and hand, fall into the power of the red devils." "Look to yourself, Abiram, and spare your breath. If you can, use it only to frighten the woman and her huddling girls. You have whitened the face of Ellen Wade already, who looks as pale as if she was staring to-day at the very Indians you name, when I was forced to speak to her through the rifle, because I couldn't reach her ears with my tongue. How was it, Nell? You have never given the reason of your deafness." The colour of Ellen's cheek changed as suddenly as the squatter's piece had flashed on the occasion to which he alluded, the burning glow suffusing her features, until it even mantled her throat with its fine, healthful tinge. She hung her head abashed, but did not seem to think it necessary to reply. Ishmael, too sluggish to pursue the subject, or content with the appointed allusion he had just made, rose from his seat on the rock, and stretching his heavy frame, like a well-fed and fattened ox, he announced his intention to sleep. Among a race who lived chiefly for the indulgence of the natural wants, such a declaration could not fail of meeting with sympathetic dispositions. One after another disappeared, each seeking his or her rude dormitory, and before many minutes, Esther, who by this time had scolded the younger fry to sleep, found herself, if we except the usual watchman below, in solitary possession of the naked rock. Whatever less valuable fruits had been produced in this uneducated woman by her migratory habits, the great principle of female nature was too deeply rooted ever to be entirely eradicated. Of a powerful, not to say fierce temperament, her passions were violent and difficult to be smothered. But, however she might and did abuse the accidental prerogatives of her situation, love for her offspring, while it often slumbered, could never be said to become extinct. She liked not the protracted absence of Asa, too fearless herself to have hesitated an instant on her own account about crossing the dark abyss, into which she now sat looking with longing eyes, her busy imagination, in obedience to this inextinguishable sentiment, began to conjure nameless evils on account of her son. It might be true, as Abiram had hinted, that he had become a captive to some of the tribes who were hunting the buffalo in that vicinity, or even a still more dreadful calamity might have befallen. So thought the mother, while silence and darkness lent their aid to the secret impulses of nature. Agitated by these reflections, which put sleep at defiance, Esther continued at her post, listening with that sort of acuteness which is termed instinct in the animals a few degrees below her in the scale of intelligence, for any of those noises which might indicate the approach of footsteps. At length her wishes had an appearance of being realized, for the long-desired sounds were distinctly audible, and presently she distinguished the dim form of a man at the base of the rock.
"Now, Asa, richly do you deserve to be left with an earthen bed this blessed night,"
the woman began to mutter, with a revolution in her feelings that will not be surprising to those who have made the contradictions that give variety to the human character a study.
"And a hard one, I've a mind it shall be. Why, Abner, Abner, do you sleep? Let me not see you dare to open the hole till I get down. I will know who it is that wishes to disturb a peaceable, and an honest family too, at such a time in the night as this." "Woman,"
exclaimed a voice that intended to bluster, while the speaker was manifestly a little apprehensive of the consequences. "Woman, I forbid you on pain of the law to project any of your infernal missiles. I am a citizen and a freeholder and a graduate of 2 universities, and I stand upon my rights. Beware of malice prepense, of chance medley, and of manslaughter. It is I, your amicus, a friend, an inmate, I, Dr. Obed Badius." "Who?" demanded Esther, in a voice that nearly refused to convey her words to the ears of the anxious listener beneath. "Did you say it was not Asa?" "Nay, I am neither Asa, nor Absalom, nor any of the Hebrew princes, but Obed, the root and stock of them all. Have I not said, woman, that you keep one in attendance who is entitled to a peaceable as well as an honourable mission? Do you take me for an animal of the class amphibia, and that I can play with my lungs as a blacksmith does with his bellows?" The naturalist might have expanded his breath much longer, without producing any desirable result, had Esther been his only auditor. Disappointed and alarmed, the woman had already sought her pallet, and was preparing, with a sort of desperate indifference, to compose herself to sleep. Abner, the sentinel below, however, had been aroused from an exceedingly equivocal situation by the outcry, and as he had now regained sufficient consciousness to recognize the voice of the physician, the latter was admitted with the least possible delay. Dr. Badius bustled through the narrow entrance with an air of singular impatience, and was already beginning to mount the difficult ascent, when catching a view of the porter, he paused, to observe with an air that he intended should be impressively admonitory. "Abner, there are dangerous symptoms of somnolency about thee. It is sufficiently exhibited in a tendency to hiation. It may prove dangerous not only to yourself, but to all thy father's family." "You never made a greater mistake, doctor," returned the youth, gaping like an indolent lion. "I haven't a symptom, as you call it, about any part of me; and as to father and the children, I reckon the smallpox and the measles have been thoroughly through the breed these many months ago." Content with his brief admonition, the naturalist had surmounted half the difficulties of the ascent, before the deliberate Abner ended his justification. On the summit, Obed fully expected to encounter Esther, of whose linguacious powers he had too often been furnished with the most sinister reproofs, and of which he stood in awe too salutary to covet a repetition of the attacks. The reader can foresee that he was to be agreeably disappointed. Treading lightly, and looking timidly over his shoulder, as if he apprehended a shower of something, even more formidable than words, the doctor proceeded to the place which had been allocated to himself in the general disposition of the dormitories. Instead of sleeping, the worthy naturalist sat ruminating over what he had seen and heard that day, until the tossing and mutterings which proceeded from the cabin of Esther, who was his nearest neighbour, advertised him of the wakeful situation of his inmate. Perceiving the necessity of doing something to disarm this female Cerberus, before his own purpose could be accomplished, the doctor, reluctant as he was to encounter her tongue, found himself compelled to invite a colloquial communication. "You appear not to sleep, my very kind and worthy Mrs. Bush," he said, determined to commence his applications with a plaster that was usually found to adhere. "You appear to rest badly, my excellent hostess. Can I administer to your ailings?" "What would you give me, man?" grumbled Esther. "A blister to make me sleep? Say rather a cataplasm. But if you are in pain, here are some cordial drops, which, taken in a glass of my own cognac, will give you rest, if I know aught of the materia medica." The doctor, as he very well knew, had assailed Esther on her weak side, and as he doubted not of the acceptable quality of his prescription, he sat himself at work, without unnecessary delay, to prepare it. When he made his offering, it was received in a snappish and threatening manner, but swallowed with a facility that sufficiently proclaimed how much it was relished. The woman muttered her thanks, and her leech reseated himself in silence, to await the operation of the dose. In less than half an hour the breathing of Esther became so profound, and as the doctor himself might have termed it, so very abstracted, that had he not known how easy it was to ascribe this new instance of somnolency to the powerful dose of opium with which he had garnished the brandy, he might have seen reason to distrust his own prescription. With the sleep of the restless woman, the stillness became profound and general. Then Dr. Badius saw fit to arise, with the silence and caution of the midnight robber, and to steal out of his own cabin, or rather kennel, for it deserved no better name, towards the adjoining dormitories. Here he took time to assure himself that all his neighbours were buried in deep sleep, Once advised of this important fact, he hesitated no longer, but commenced the difficult ascent which led to the upper pinnacle of the rock. His advance, though abundantly guarded, was not entirely noiseless; but while he was felicitating himself on having successfully effected his object, and he was in the very act of placing his foot on the highest ledge, a hand was laid upon the skirts of his coat, which as effectually put an end to his advance, as if the gigantic strength of Ishmael himself had pinned him to the earth. "Is there sickness in the tent?" whispered a soft voice in his very ear, "that Dr. Battius is called to visit at such an hour?" So soon as the heart of the naturalist had returned from its hasty expedition into his throat, as one less skilled than Dr. Battius in the formation of the animal would have been apt to have accounted for the extraordinary sensation with which he received this unlooked-for interruption, he found resolution to reply, using as much in terror as in prudence the same precaution in the indulgence of his voice. "My worthy Nelly, I am greatly rejoiced to find it is no other than thee. Shish, child, shish! Should Ishmael gain the knowledge of our plans, he would not hesitate to cast us both from this rock upon the plain beneath. Shish, Nelly, shish!" As the doctor delivered his injunctions between the intervals of his ascent, by the time they were concluded both he and his auditor gained the upper level. "And now, Dr. Battius," the girl gravely demanded, "may I know the reason why you have run so great a risk of flying from this place, without wings, and at the certain expense of your neck?" "Nothing shall be concealed from thee, worthy and trusty Nelly, but you are certain that Ishmael will not awake?" "No fear of him. He will sleep until the sun scorches his eyelids. The danger is from my aunt." "Esther sleepeth," the doctor sententiously replied. "Ellen, you have been watching on this rock to-day?" "I was ordered to do so." "And you have seen the bison, and the antelope, and the wolf, and the deer, as usual, animals of the orders Pecora, Bellule, and Prairie?" "I have seen the creatures you named in English, but I know nothing of the Indian languages." "There is still an order that I have not named, which you have also seen, the primates. Is it not true?" "I cannot say. I know no animal by that name." "Nay, Ellen, you confer with a friend, of the genus Homo, child." "Whatever else I may have had in view, I have not seen the Vespertilio Haribi—" "Hush, Nelly, thy vivacity will betray us. Tell me, girl, have you not seen certain bipeds called men, wandering about the prairies?" "Surely, my uncle and his sons have been hunting the buffalo, since the sun began to fall." "I must speak in the vernacular to be comprehended. Ellen, I would say of this species, Kentucky." Though Ellen reddened like the rose, her blushes were concealed by the darkness. She hesitated an instant, and then summoned sufficient spirit to say decidedly— "If you wish to speak in parables, Dr. Battius, you must find another listener. Put your questions plainly in English, and I will answer them honestly in the same tongue." "I have been journeying in this desert, as thou knowest, Nelly, in quest of animals that have been hidden from the eyes of science until now. Among others, I have discovered a primates of the genus Homo, species Kentucky, which I term Paul—" "Shish! For the sake of mercy," said Ellen, "speak lower, doctor, or we shall be ruined." "Hover. By profession a collector of the apes or bee," continued the other. "Do I use the vernacular now? Am I understood?" "Perfectly, perfectly," returned the girl, breathing with difficulty in her surprise. "But what of him? Did he tell you to mount this rock? He knows nothing himself, for the oath I gave my uncle has shut my mouth." "Ay, but there is one that has taken no oath, who has revealed all. I would that the mantle which is wrapped around the mysteries of nature were as effectually withdrawn from its hidden treasures. Ellen, Ellen, the man with whom I have unwittingly formed a compactum or agreement is sadly forgetful of the obligations of honesty. Thy uncle, child." "You mean Ishmael Bush, my father's brother's widow's husband?" returned the offended girl, a little proudly. "Indeed, indeed, it is cruel to reproach me with a tie that chance has formed, and which I would rejoice so much to break for ever." The humbled Ellen could utter no more, but sinking on a projection of the rock, she began to sob in a manner that rendered their situation doubly critical. The doctor muttered a few words which he intended as an apologetic explanation, but before he had time to complete his laboured vindication, she rose and said with decision— "I did not come here to pass my time in foolish tears, nor you to try to stop them. What then has brought you hither?" "I must see the inmate of that tent." "You know what it contains?" "I am taught to believe I do, and I bear a letter which I must deliver with my own hands. If the animal prove a quadruped, Ishmael is a true man.
if a biped, fledged or unfledged, I care not, he is false, and our compactum at an end."
Ellen made a sign for the doctor to remain where he was, and to be silent. She then glided into the tent, where she continued many minutes, that proved exceedingly weary and anxious to the expectant without, but the instant she returned, she took him by the arm, and together they entered beneath the folds of the mysterious cloth. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of the Prairie, by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck.
Pray God, the Duke of York excuse himself. King Henry the Sixth.
The mustering of the borderers on the following morning was silent, sullen, and gloomy. The repast of that hour was wanting in the inharmonious accompaniment with which Esther ordinarily enlivened their meals, for the effects of the powerful opiate that Doctor had administered still muddled her intellects. The young men brooded over the absence of their elder brother, and the brows of Ishmael himself were knit, as he cast his scowling eyes from one to the other, like a man preparing to meet and to repel an expected assault on his authority. In the midst of this family distrust, Ellen and her midnight confederate, the naturalist, took their usual places among the children, without awakening suspicion or exciting comment. The only apparent fruits of the adventure in which they had been engaged were occasional uplifting of the eyes, on the part of the doctor, which were mistaken by the observers for some of his scientific contemplations of the heavens, but which, in reality, were no other than furtive glances at the fluttering walls of the prescribed tent. At length the squatter, who had waited in vain for some more decided manifestation of the expected rising among his sons, resolved to make a demonstration of his own intentions. "Asa shall account to me for this undutiful conduct," he observed. "Here has the lifelong night gone by, and he out lying on the prairie, when his hand and his rifle might have both been wanted in a brush with the Sioux, for any right he had to know the contrary."
"Spare your breath, good man," retorted his wife. "Be saving of your breath, for you may have to call long enough for the boy before he will answer."
"It ar' a fact, that some men be so womanish as to let the young master the old. But you, old Esther, should know better than to think such will ever be the nature of things in the family of Ishmael Bush."
"Ah, you are a Hector with the boys, when need calls. I know it well, Ishmael, and one of your sons have you driven from you by your temper, and that too at a time when he is most wanted."
"Father," said Abner, whose sluggish nature had gradually been stimulating itself to the exertion of taking so bold a stand,
"the boys and I have pretty generally concluded to go out on the search of Asa. We are disagreeable about his camping on the prairie, instead of coming into his own bed, as we all know he would like to do."
"Pshaw!" muttered Abiram. "The boy has killed a buck, or perhaps a buffaloe, and he is sleeping by the carcass to keep off the wolves till day. We shall soon see him, or hear him, bawling for help to bring in his load."
"'Tis little help that a son of mine will call for to shoulder a buck or to quarter your wild beef," returned the mother. "And you, Abiram, to say so uncertain a thing! You who said yourself that the redskins have been prowling around this place no later than the yesterday."
"I!" exclaimed her brother, hastily, as if anxious to retract an error.
"I said it then, and I say it now, and so you will find it to be. The Tetons are in our neighbourhood, and happy will it prove for the boy if he is well shut of them."
"It seems to me,"
said Dr. Battius, speaking with the sort of deliberation and dignity one is apt to use after having thoroughly ripened his opinions by sufficient reflection,
"It seems to me a man but little skilled in the signs and tokens of Indian warfare, especially as practised in these remote plains, but one who I may say without vanity has some insight into the mysteries of nature. It seems then to me thus humbly qualified, that when doubts exist in a matter of moment, it would always be the wisest course to appease them."
"No more of your doctoring for me," cried the grum Esther. "No more of your quiddities in a healthy family, say I. Here was I doing well, only a little out of sorts with over instructing the young, and you douse me with a drug that hangs about my tongue, like a pound weight on a humming bird's wing."
"Is the medicine out?" dryly demanded Ishmael. "It must be a rare dose that gives a heavy feel to the tongue of old Esther."
"Friend," continued the doctor, waving his hand for the angry wife to maintain the peace, "that it cannot perform all that is said of it, the very charge of good Mrs. Bush is a sufficient proof. But to speak of the absent Asa, there is doubt as to his fate, and there is a proposition to solve it. Now, in the natural sciences truth is always a desideratum, and I confess it would seem to be equally so in the present case of domestic uncertainty, which may be called a vacuum, where, according to the laws of physic, there should exist some pretty palpable proofs of materiality." "Don't mind him, don't mind him," cried Esther, observing that the rest of his auditors listened with an attention which might proceed equally from acquiescence in his proposal, or ignorance of its meaning. "There is a drug in every word he utters." "Dr. Battius wishes to say," Ellen modestly interposed, "that as some of us think Asa is in danger, and some think otherwise, the whole family might pass an hour or two in looking for him." "Does he?" interrupted the woman. "Then Dr. Battius has more sense in him than I believe. She is right, Ishmael, and what she says shall be done. I will shoulder a rifle myself, and woe betide the red-skin that crosses my path. I have pulled a trigger before to-day, and heard an Indian yell, too, to my sorrow." The spirit of Esther diffused itself, like the stimulus which attends a war cry among her sons. They arose in a body, and declared a determination to second so bold a resolution. Ishmael prudently yielded to an impulse he could not resist, and in a few minutes the woman appeared, shouldering her arms, prepared to lead forth in person such of her descendants as chose to follow. "Let them stay with the children that please," she said, "and then follow me who are not chicken-hearted." "Abiram, it will not do to leave the huts without some guard," Ishmael whispered, glancing his eye upward. The man whom he addressed started, and betrayed extraordinary eagerness in his reply. "I will tarry and watch the camp." A dozen voices were instantly raised in objections to this proposal. He was wanted to point out the places where the hostile tracks had been seen, and his termagant sister openly scouted at the idea as unworthy of his manhood. The reluctant Abiram was compelled to yield, and Ishmael made a new disposition for the defence of the place, which was admitted, by every one, to be all important to their security and comfort. He offered the post of commandant to Dr. Battius, who, however, peremptorily and somewhat haughtily declined the doubtful honour, exchanging looks of intelligence with Ellen as he did so. In this dilemma the squatter was obliged to constitute the girl herself castellan, taking care, however, in deputing this important trust, to omit no words of caution and instruction. When this preliminary point was settled, the young men proceeded to arrange certain means of defence and signals of alarm, that were adapted to the weakness and character of the garrison. Several masses of rock were drawn to the edge of the upper level, and so placed as to leave it at the discretion of the feeble Ellen and her associates, to cast them or not, as they might choose, on the heads of any invaders who would of necessity be obliged to mount the eminence by the difficult and narrow passage already so often mentioned. In addition to this formidable obstruction, the barriers were strengthened and rendered nearly impassable. Smaller missiles, that might be hurled even by the hands of the younger children, but which would prove, from the elevation of the place, exceedingly dangerous, were provided in profusion. A pile of dried leaves and splinters were placed, as a beacon, on the upper rock, and then, even in the jealous judgment of the squatter, the post was deemed competent to maintain a credible siege. The moment the rock was thought to be in a state of sufficient security, the party who composed what might be called the sortie sallied forth on their anxious expedition. The advance was led by Esther in person, who, attired in a dress half masculine, and bearing a weapon like the rest, seemed no unfit leader for the group of wildly clad frontiersmen that followed in her rear. "Now, Abiram," cried the Amazon, in a voice that was cracked and harsh, for the simple reason of being used too often on a strained and unnatural key. "Now, Abiram, run with your nose low, show yourself a hound of the true breed, and do some credit to your training. You it was that saw the prints of the Indian moccasin, and it behooves you to let others be as wise as yourself. Come to the front, man, and give us a bold lead." The brother, who appeared at all times to stand in awe of his sister's authority, complied. though it was with a reluctance so evident as to excite sneers even among the unobservant and indolent sons of the squatter. Ishmael himself moved among his tall children like one who expected nothing from the search, and who was indifferent alike to its success or failure. In this manner the party proceeded until their distant fortress had sunk so low as to present an object no larger nor more distinct than a hazy point on the margin of the prairie. Hitherto their progress had been silent and somewhat rapid, for as swell after swell was mounted and passed, without varying or discovering a living object to enliven the monotony of the view, even the tongue of Esther was hushed in increasing anxiety. Here, however, Ishmael chose to pause, and casting the butt of his rifle from his shoulder to the ground, he observed— "This is enough. Buffalo signs and deer signs are plenty. But where are thy Indian footsteps, Abiram?" "Still farther west," returned the other, pointing in the direction he named. "This was the spot where I struck the tracks of the buck. It was after I took the deer that I fell upon the Teton trail." "And a bloody piece of work you made of it, man!" cried the squatter, pointing tauntily to the soiled garments of his kinsman, and then directing the attention of the spectators to his own, by the way of a triumphant contrast. "Here have I cut the throats of 2 lively does and a scampering fawn, without spot or stain, while you, blundering dog as you are, have made as much work for Esther and her girls as though butchering was your regular calling. Come, boys, it is enough. I am too old not to know the signs of the frontiers. No Indian has been here since the last fall of water. Follow me, and I will make a turn that shall give us at least the beef of a fallow cow for our trouble." "Follow me!" echoed Esther, stepping undauntedly forward. "I am leader to-day, and I will be followed. Who so proper, let me know, as a mother, to head a search for her own lost child?" Ishmael regarded his intractable mate with a smile of indulgent pity. Observing that she had already struck out a path for herself, different both from that of Abiram and the one he had seen fit to choose, and being unwilling to draw the cord of authority too tight, just at that moment he submitted himself to her will. But Dr. Battius, who had hitherto been a silent and thoughtful attendant on the woman, now saw fit to raise his feeble voice in the way of remonstrance. "I agree with thy partner in life, worthy and gentle Mrs. Bush," he said, "in believing that some ignis fatuus of the imagination has deceived Abiram in the signs of symptoms of which he has spoken." "Symptoms yourself!" interrupted the termagant. "This is no time for bookish words, nor is this a place to stop and swallow medicines. If you are a leg weary, say so, as a plain-speaking man should. Then seat yourself on the prairie, like a hound that is foot-sore, and take your natural rest." "I accord in the opinion," the naturalist calmly replied, complying literally with the opinion of the deriding Esther, by taking his seat very coolly by the side of an indigenous shrub, the examination of which he commenced on the instant, in the order that science might not lose any of its just and important dues. "I honour your excellent advice, Mistress Esther, as you may perceive. Go thou in quest of thy offspring, while I tarry here in pursuit of that which is better, viz. An insight into the arcana of nature's volume." The woman answered with a hollow, unnatural, and scornful laugh, and even her heavy sons, as they slowly passed the seat of the already abstracted naturalist, did not disdain to manifest their contempt in smiles. In a few minutes the train mounted the nearest eminence, and as it turned the rounded acclivity, the doctor was left to pursue his profitable investigations in entire solitude. Another half-hour passed, during which Esther continued to advance on her seemingly fruitless search. Her pauses, however, were becoming frequent, and her looks wandering and uncertain, when footsteps were heard clattering through the bottom, and at the next instant a buck was seen to bound up the ascent, and to dart from before their eyes in the direction of the naturalist. So sudden and unlooked for had been the passage of the animal, and so much had he been favoured by the shape of the ground, that before any one of the foresters had time to bring his rifle to his shoulder, it was already beyond the range of a bullet. "Look out for the wolf!" shouted Abner, shaking his head in vexation at being a single moment too late. "A wolf's skin will be no bad gift in a winter's night. Ay, yonder the hungry devil comes." "Hold!" cried Ishmael, knocking up the levelled weapon of his too eager son. "'Tis not a wolf, but a hound of thorough blood and bottom. Ha! we have hunters nigh; there are 2 of them." He was still speaking when the animals in question came leaping on the track of the deer, striving with noble ardour to outdo each other. One was an aged dog, whose strength seemed to be sustained purely by generous emulation, and the other a pup, that gambolled even while he pressed most warmly on the chase. They both ran, however, with clean and powerful leaps, carrying their noses high, like animals of the most keen and subtle scent. They had passed, and in another minute they would have been running open-mouthed with the deer in view, had not the younger dog suddenly bounded from the course, and uttered a cry of surprise. His aged companion stopped also, and returned panting and exhausted to the place where the other was whirling around in swift and apparently in mad evolutions, circling the spot in his own footsteps, and continuing his outcry in a short, snappish barking. But when the elder hound had reached the spot, he seated himself, and lifting his nose high in the air, he raised a long, loud, and wailing howl. "It must be a strong scent," said Abner, who had been with the rest of the family, an admiring observer of the movements of the dogs, "that can break off two such creatures so suddenly from their trail." "Murder them!" cried Abiram. "I'll swear to the old hound 'tis the dog of the trapper, whom we now know to be our mortal enemy." Though the brother of Esther gave so hostile advice, he appeared in no way ready to put it in execution himself. The surprise, which had taken possession of the whole party, exhibited itself in his own vacant, wondering stare, as strongly as in any of the admiring visages by whom he was surrounded. His denunciation, therefore, notwithstanding its dire import, was disregarded, and the dogs were left to obey the impulses of their mysterious instinct, without let or hindrance. It was long before any of the spectators broke the silence, but the squatter at length so far recollected his authority as to take on himself the right to control the movements of his children. "Come away, boys; come away, and leave the hounds to sing their tunes for their own amusement," Ishmael said, in his coldest manner. "I scorn to take the life of a beast because its master has pitched himself too nigh my clearing. Come away, boys, come away. We have enough of our own work before us, without turning aside to do that of the whole neighbourhood." "Come not away!" cried Esther, in tones that sounded like the admonitions of some sibyl. "I say, come not away, my children. There is meaning and warning in this, and as I am a woman and a mother, will I know the truth of it all." So saying, the awakened wife brandished her weapon, with an air that was not without its wild and secret influence, and led the way towards the spot where the dogs still remained, filling the air with their long-drawn and piteous complaints. The whole party followed in her steps, some too indolent to oppose, others obedient to her will, and all more or less excited by the uncommon character of the scene. "Tell me, you, Abner, Abiram, Ishmael," the woman cried, standing over a spot where the earth was trampled and beaten, and plainly sprinkled with blood. "Tell me, you who are hunters, what sort of animal has here met his death? Speak! Ye are men, and used to the signs of the plains. Is it the blood of wolf or panther?" "A buffaloe, and a noble and powerful creature has it been," returned the squatter, who looked down calmly on the fatal signs which so strangely affected his wife. "Here are the marks of the spot where he has struck his hoofs into the earth, in the death struggle, and yonder he has plunged and torn the ground with his horns. Ay, a buffalo bull of wonderful strength and courage has he been." "And who has slain him?" continued Esther. "Man, where are the offals? Wolves! They devoured the hide. Tell me, ye men and hunters, is this the blood of a beast?" "The creature has plunged over the hillock," said Abner, who had proceeded a short distance beyond the rest of the party. "Ah! there you will find it, in yon swale of alders. Look! 1,000 carrion birds are hovering above the carcass." "The animal still has life in him," returned the squatter, "or the buzzards would settle upon their prey. By the action of the dogs, it must be something ravenous. I reckon it is the white bear from the upper falls. They are said to cling desperately to life." "Let us go back," said Abiram. "There may be danger, and there can be no good in attacking a ravenous beast. Remember, Ishmael, 'twill be a risky job and one of small profit." The young men smiled at this new proof of the well-known pusillanimity of their uncle. The oldest even proceeded so far as to express his contempt, by bluntly saying— "It will do to cage with the other animal we carry. Then we may go back double-handed into the settlements, and set up for showmen around the court-houses and gaols of Kentucky." The threatening frown which gathered on the brow of his father admonished the young man to forbear. Exchanging looks that were half rebellious with his brethren, he saw fit to be silent. but instead of observing the caution recommended by Abiram, they proceeded in a body until they again came to a halt within a few yards of the matted cover of the thicket. The scene had now indeed become wild and striking enough to have produced a powerful effect on the minds better prepared than those of the unnurtured family of the squatter to resist the impressions of so exciting a spectacle. The heavens were, as usual at the season, covered with dark, driving clouds, beneath which interminable flocks of aquatic birds were again on the wing, holding their toilsome and heavy way towards the distant waters of the south. The wind had risen, and was once more sweeping over the prairie in gusts, which it was often vain to oppose, and then again the blasts would seem to mount into the upper air, as if to sport with the drifting vapour, whirling and rolling vast masses of the dusky and ragged volumes over each other, in a terrific and yet grand disorder. Above the little break the flock of birds still held their flight, circling with heavy wings about the spot, struggling at times against a torrent of wind, and then, favoured by their position and height, making bold swoops upon the thicket, away from which, however, they never failed to sail, screaming in terror, as if apprised, either by sight or instinct, that the hour of their voracious dominion had not yet fully arrived. Ishmael stood for many minutes, with his wife and children clustered together, in an amazement, with which awe was singularly mingled, gazing in death-like stillness on the sight. The voice of Esther at length broke the charm, and reminded the spectators of the necessity of resolving their doubts in some manner more worthy of their manhood than by dull and inactive observation. "Call on the dogs," she said, "call on the hounds, and put them in the thicket. There are men enough of ye, if ye have not lost the spirit with which I know ye were born, to tame the tempers of all the bears west of the big river. Call on the dogs, I say, you, Enoch, Abner, Gabriel, has wonder made ye deaf?" One of the young men complied, and having succeeded in detaching the hounds from the place, around which, until then, they had not ceased to hover, he led them down to the margin of the thicket. "Put them in, boy, put them in," continued the woman. "And you, Ishmael and Abiram, if anything wicked or harmful comes forth, show them the use of your rifles, like frontiermen. If ye are wanting in spirit, before the eyes of my children will I put ye both to shame." The youths, who until now had detained the hounds, let slip the thongs of skin, by which they had been held, and urged them to the attack by their voices. But it would seem that the elder dog was restrained by some extraordinary sensation, or that he was much too experienced to attempt the rash adventure. After proceeding a few yards to the very verge of the brake, he made a sudden pause, and stood trembling in all his aged limbs, apparently as unable to recede as to advance. The encouraging calls of the young men were disregarded, or only answered by a low and plaintive whining. For a minute the pup also was similarly affected, but less sage, or more easily excited. He was induced at length to leap forward, and finally to dash into the cover. An alarmed and startling howl was heard, and at the next minute he broke out of the thicket, and commenced circling the spot in the same wild and unsteady manner as before. "Have I a man among my children?" demanded Esther. "Give me a trucer piece than a childish shotgun, and I will show ye what the courage of a frontier woman can do." "Stay, mother," exclaimed Abner and Enoch. "If you will see the creature, let us drive it into view." This was quite as much as the youths were accustomed to utter, even on more important occasions, but having given a pledge of their intentions, they were far from being backward in redeeming it. Preparing their arms with the utmost care, they advanced with steadiness to the brake. Nerves, less often tried than those of the young borderers, might have shrunk before the dangers of so uncertain an undertaking. As they proceeded, the howls of the dogs became more shrill and plaintive. The vultures and buzzards settled so low as to flap the bushes with their heavy wings, and the wind came hoarsely sweeping along the naked prairie, as if the spirits of the air had also descended to witness the approaching development. There was a breathless moment, when the blood of the undaunted Esther flowed backward to her heart, as she saw her sons push aside the matted branches of the thicket, and bury themselves in its labyrinth. A deep and solemn pause succeeded. Then arose two loud and piercing cries in quick succession, which were followed by a quiet, still more awful and appalling. Come back, my children," cried the woman, the feelings of a mother getting the ascendancy. But her voice has hushed, and every faculty seemed frozen with horror, as at that instant the bushes once more parted, and the two adventurers reappeared, pale and nearly insensible themselves, and laid at her feet the stiff and motionless body of the lost Asa, with the marks of a violent death but too plainly stamped on every pallid lineament. The dogs uttered a long and closing howl, and then breaking off together, they disappeared on the forsaken trail with the deer. The flight of birds wheeled upward into the heavens, filling the air with their complaints at having been robbed of a victim, which, frightful and disgusting as it was, still bore too much of the impression of humanity to become the prey of their obscene appetites. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. A pickaxe and a spade, 4 in a shrouding sheet. Oh, a pit of clay for to be made, for such a guest is meet. Song in Hamlet. Stand back, stand off, the whole of ye, said Esther hoarsely to the crowd, which pressed too closely on the corpse. I am his mother, and my right is better than that of ye all. Who has done this? Tell me, Ishmael, Abiram, Abner, open your mouths and your hearts, and let God's truth and no other issue from them. Who has done this bloody deed? Her husband made no reply, but stood, leaning on his rifle, looking sadly, but with an unaltered eye, at the mangled remains of his son. Not so the mother. She threw herself on the earth, and receiving the cold and ghastly head into her lap, she sat contemplating those muscular features, on which the death agony was still horridly impressed, in a silence far more expressive than any language of lamentation could have proved. The voice of the woman was frozen in grief. In vain Ishmael attempted a few words of rude consolation. She neither listened nor answered. Her sons gathered about her in a circle, and expressed, after their uncouth manner, their sympathy in her sorrow, as well as their sense of their own loss, but she motioned them away impatiently with her hand. At times her fingers played in the matted hair of the dead, and at others they lightly attempted to smooth the painfully expressive muscles of its ghastly visage, as the hand of the mother is seen lingering fondly about the features of her sleeping child. Then, starting from their revolting office, her hands would flutter around her, and seem to seek some fruitless remedy against the violent blow, which had thus suddenly destroyed the child, in whom she had not only placed her greatest hopes, but so much of her maternal pride. While engaged in the latter incomprehensible manner, the lethargic Abner turned aside, and swallowing the unwonted emotions, which were rising in his own throat, he observed, Mother means that we should look for the signs, that we may know in what manner Asa has come by his end. We owe it to the accursed Sioux, answered Ishmael. Twice have they put me deeply in their debt. The third time the score shall be cleared. But, not content with this plausible explanation, and perhaps secretly glad to avert their eyes from a spectacle which awakened so extraordinary and unusual sensations in their sluggish bosoms, the sons of the squatter turned away in a body from their mother and the corpse, and proceeded to make the inquiries which they fancied the former had so repeatedly demanded. Ishmael made no objections, but though he accompanied his children while they proceeded in the investigation, it was more with the appearance of complying with their wishes, at a time when resistance might not be seemly, than with any visible interest in the result. As the borderers, notwithstanding their usual dullness, were well instructed in most things connected with their habits of life, an inquiry, the success of which depended so much on signs and evidences that bore so strong a resemblance to a forest trail, was likely to be conducted with skill and acuteness. Accordingly, they proceeded to the melancholy task with great readiness and intelligence. Abner and Enoch agreed in their accounts as to the position in which they had found the body. It was seated nearly upright, the back supported by a mass of matted brush, and one hand still grasping a broken twig of the alders. It was probably owing to the former circumstance that the body had escaped the rapacity of the carrion birds, which had been seen hovering above the thicket, and the latter proved that life had not yet entirely abandoned the hapless victim when he entered the brake. The opinion now became general, that the youth had received his death wound in the open prairie, and had dragged his enfeebled form into the cover of the thicket for the purpose of concealment. A trail through the bushes confirmed this opinion. It also appeared, on examination, that a desperate struggle had taken place on the very margin of the thicket. This was sufficiently apparent by the trodden branches, the deep impressions on the moist grounds, and the lavish flow of blood. "He has been shot in the open ground, and come here for a cover," said Abiram. "These marks would clearly prove it. The boy has been set upon by the savages in a body, and has fought like a hero, as he was until they had mastered his strength, and then drawn him into the bushes." To this probable opinion there was now but one dissenting voice, that of the slow-minded Ishmael, who demanded that the corpse itself should be examined, in order to obtain a more accurate knowledge of its injuries. On examination, it appeared that a rifle bullet had passed directly through the body of the deceased, entering beneath one of his brawny shoulders, and making its exit by the breast. It required some knowledge in gunshot wounds to decide this delicate point, but the experience of the borderers was quite equal to the scrutiny, and a smile of wild and certainly of singular satisfaction passed among the sons of Ishmael, when Abner confidently announced that the enemies of Asa had assailed him in the rear. "It must be so," said the gloomy but attentive squatter. "He was of too good a stock, and too well trained knowingly to turn the weak side to man or beast. Remember, boys, that while the front of manhood is to your enemy, let him be, who or what he may, you are safe from cowardly surprise. Why, Esther, woman, you are getting beside yourself with picking at the hair and the garments of the child. Little good you can do him now, old girl." "See," interrupted Enoch, extricating from the fragments of cloth the morsel of lead, which had prostrated the strength of one so powerful. "Here is the very bullet." Ishmael took it in his hand, and eyed it long and closely. "There's no mistake," at length he muttered through his compressed teeth. "It's from the pouch of that accursed trapper. Like many of the hunters, he has a mark in his mould, in order to know the work of his rifle performs. And here you see it plainly, 6 little holes, laid crossways." "I'll swear to it," cried Abiram, triumphantly. "He showed me his private mark himself, and boasted of the number of deer he had laid upon the prairies with these very bullets. Now, Ishmael, will you believe me when I tell you the old knave is a spy of the redskins?" The lead passed from the hand of one to that of another, and unfortunately for the reputation of the old man, several among them remembered also to have seen the aforesaid private bullet marks during the curious examination which all had made of his accoutrements. In addition to this wound, however, were many others of a less dangerous nature, all of which were supposed to confirm the supposed guilt of the trapper. The traces of many different struggles were to be seen, between the spot where the first blood was spilt, and the thicket to which it was now generally believed Asa had retreated as a place of refuge. These were interpreted into so many proofs of the weakness of the murderer, who would have sooner dispatched his victim, had not even the dying strength of the youth rendered him formidable to the infirmities of one so old. The danger of drawing some others of the hunters to the spot by repeated firing was deemed a sufficient reason for not again resorting to the rifle, after it had performed the important duty of disabling the victim. The weapon of the dead man was not to be found, and had doubtless, together with many other less valuable and lighter articles, that he was accustomed to carry about his person, become a prize to his destroyer. But what, in addition to the telltale bullet, appeared to fix the ruthless deed with peculiar certainty on the trapper, was the accumulated evidence furnished by the trail, which proved, notwithstanding his deadly hurt, that the wounded man had still been able to make a long and desperate resistance to the subsequent efforts of his murderer. Ishmael seemed to press this proof with a singular mixture of sorrow and pride. Sorrow at the loss of a son, whom in their moments of amity he highly valued, and pride at the courage and power he had manifested to his last and weakest breath. "He died as a son of mine should die," said the squatter, gleaning a hollow consolation from so unnatural an exultation. "A dread to his enemy to the last, and without help from the law. Come, children, we have the grave to make, and then to hunt his murderer." The sons of the squatter set about their melancholy office in silence and in sadness. An excavation was made in the hard earth, at a great expense of toil and time, and the body was wrapped in such spare vestments as could be collected among the labourers. When these arrangements were completed, Ishmael approached the seemingly unconscious Esther, and announced his intention to inter the dead, She heard him, and quietly relinquished her grasp of the corpse, rising in silence to follow it to its narrow resting place. Here she seated herself again at the head of the grave, watching each movement of the youths with eager and jealous eyes. When a sufficiency of earth was laid upon the senseless clay of Asa, to protect it from injury, Enoch and Abner entered the cavity, and trode it into a solid mass, by the weight of their huge frames, with an appearance of a strange, not to say savage, mixture of care and indifference. This well-known precaution was adopted to prevent the speedy exhumation of the body by some of the carnivorous beasts of the prairie, whose instinct was sure to guide them to the spot. Even the rapacious birds appeared to comprehend the nature of the ceremony, for, mysteriously apprised that the miserable victim was now about to be abandoned by the human race, they once more began to make their airy circuits above the place, screaming, as if to frighten the kinsmen from their labour of caution and love. Ishmael stood with folded arms, steadily watching the manner in which this necessary duty was performed, and when the whole was completed, he lifted his cap to his sons, to thank them for their services, with a dignity that would have become one much better nurtured. Throughout the whole of the ceremony, which is ever solemn and admonitory, the squatter had maintained a grave and serious deportment. His vast features were visibly stamped with an expression of deep concern, but at no time did they falter, until he turned his back, as he believed forever, on the grave of his firstborn. Nature was then stirring powerfully within him, and the muscles of his stern visage began to work perceptibly. His children fastened their eyes on his, as if to seek a direction to the strange emotions which were moving their own heavy natures, when the struggle in the bosom of the squatter suddenly ceased, and, taking his wife by the arm, he raised her to her feet as if she had been an infant, saying, in a voice that was perfectly steady, though a nice observer would have discovered that it was kinder than usual. "Esther, we have now done all that man and woman can do. We raised the boy, made him such as few others were like, on the frontiers of America, and we have given him a grave. Let us go our way." The woman turned her eyes slowly from the fresh earth, and laying her hands on the shoulders of her husband, stood, looking him anxiously in the eyes. "Ishmael, Ishmael," she said, "you parted from the boy in your wrath." "May the Lord pardon his sins freely, as I have forgiven him his worst misdeeds," calmly returned the squatter. "Woman, go you back to the rock and read your Bible. A chapter in that book always does you good. You can read, Esther, which is a privilege I never did enjoy." "Yes, yes," muttered the woman, yielding to his strength, and suffering herself to be led, though with strong reluctance, from the spot. "I can read, and how have I used the knowledge? But he, Ishmael, he has not the sin of wasted learning to answer for. We have spared him that at least. Whether it be in mercy or in cruelty, I know not." Her husband made no reply, but continued steadily to lead her in the direction of their temporary abode. When they reached the summit of the swell of land, which they knew was the last spot from which the situation of the grave of Asa could be seen, they all turned, as by common concurrence, to take a farewell view of the place. The little mound itself was not visible, but it was frightfully indicated by the flock of screaming birds, which hovered above. In the opposite direction, a low, blue hillock, in the skirts of the horizon, pointed out the place where Esther had left the rest of her young, and served as an attraction to draw her reluctant steps from the last abode of her eldest born. Nature quickened in the bosom of the mother at the sight, and she finally yielded the rights of the dead to the more urgent claims of the living. The foregoing occurrences had struck a spark from the stern tempers of a set of beings so singularly moulded in the habits of their uncultivated lives, which served to keep alive among them the dying embers of family affection. United to their parents by ties no stronger than those which use has created, there had been great danger, as Ishmael had foreseen, that the overloaded hive would swarm, and leave him saddled with the difficulties of a young and helpless brood, unsupported by the exertions of those whom he had already brought to a state of maturity. The spirit of insubordination, which emanated from the unfortunate Asa, had spread among his juniors, and the squatter had been made painfully to remember the time when, in the wantonness of his youth and vigour, he had, reversing the order of the brutes, cast off his own aged and failing parents, to enter into the world unshackled and free. But the danger had now abated, for a time at least, and if his authority was not restored with all its former influence, it was admitted to exist and to maintain its ascendancy a little longer. It is true that his slow-minded sons, even while they submitted to the impressions of the recent event, had glimmerings of terrible distrust as to the manner in which their elder brother had met with his death. There were faint and indistinct images in the minds of 2 or 3 of the oldest, which portrayed the father himself as ready to imitate the example of Abraham, without the justification of the sacred authority, which commanded the holy man to attempt the revolting office. But then, these images were so transient, and so much obscured in intellectual mist, as to leave no very strong impressions, and the tendency of the whole transaction, as we have already said, was rather to strengthen than to weaken the authority of Ishmael. In this disposition of mind, the party continued their route towards the place whence they had that morning issued on a search, which had been crowned with so melancholy a success. The long and fruitless march which they had made under the direction of Abiram, the discovery of the body, and its subsequent interment, had so far consumed the day, that by the time their steps were retraced across the broad track of waste which lay between the grave of Asa and the rock, the sun had fallen far below his meridian altitude. The hill had gradually risen as they approached, like some tower, emerging from the bosom of the sea, and when, within a mile, the minuter objects that crowned its height came dimly into view. "It will be a sad meeting for the girls," said Ishmael, who from time to time did not cease to utter something which he intended should be consolatory to the bruised spirit of his partner. "Asa was much regarded by all the young, and seldom failed to bring in from his hunts something that they loved." He did," murmured Esther. "The boy was the pride of the family. My other children are as nothing to him." "Say not so, good woman," returned the father, glancing his eye a little proudly at the athletic train which followed, at no great distance in the rear. "Say not so, old Esther, for few fathers and mothers have greater reason to be boastful than ourselves." Thankful, muttered the humbled woman. "You mean thankful, Ishmael?" "Then thankful let it be, if you like the word better, my good girl. But what has become of Nelly and the young? The child has forgotten the charge I gave her, and has not only suffered the children to sleep, but, I warrant you, is dreaming of the fields of Tennessee at this very moment. The mind of your niece is mainly fixed on the settlements, I reckon." "Ay, she is not for us. I said it and thought it when I took her, because death had stripped her of all other friends. Death is a sad worker in the bosom of families, Ishmael. Asa had a kind feeling to the child, and they might have come one day into our places, had things been so ordered." "Nay, she is not gifted for a frontier wife, if this is the manner she is to keep the house while the husband is on the hunt. Abner, let off your rifle, that they may know we are coming. I fear Nelly and the young are asleep." The young man complied with an alacrity that manifested how gladly he would see the rounded active figure of Ellen enlivening the ragged summit of the rock. But the report was succeeded by neither signal nor answer of any sort. For a moment the whole party stood in suspense, awaiting the result, and then a simultaneous impulse caused the whole to let off their pieces at the same instant, producing a noise which might not fail to reach the ears of all within so short a distance. "Ah, there they come at last!" cried Abiram, who was usually among the first to seize on any circumstance which promised relief from disagreeable apprehensions. "It is a petticoat fluttering on the line," said Esther. "I put it there myself." "You are right, but now she comes. The jade has been taking her comfort in the tent." "It is not so," said Ishmael, whose usually inflexible features were beginning to manifest the uneasiness he felt. "It is the tent itself blowing about loosely in the wind. They have loosened the bottom, like silly children as they are, and unless care is had, the whole will come down." The words were scarcely uttered before a rushing blast of wind swept by the spot where they stood, raising the dust and little eddies in the progress, and then, as if guided by a master hand, it quitted the earth and mounted to the precise spot on which all eyes were just then riveted. The loosened linen felt its influence and tottered, but regained its poise, and for a moment it became tranquil. The clouds of leaves next played encircling revolutions around the place, and then descended with the velocity of a swooping hawk, and sailed away into the prairie in long straight lines, like a flight of swallows resting on their expanded wings. They were followed for some distance by the snow-white tent, which, however, soon fell behind the rock, leaving its highest peak as naked as when it lay in the entire solitude of the desert. "The murderers have been here," moaned Esther. "My babes, my babes!" For a moment even Ishmael faltered before the weight of so unexpected a blow; but shaking himself like an awakened lion, he sprang forward, and pushing aside the impediments of the barrier, as if they had been feathers, he rushed up the ascent with an impetuosity which proved how formidable a sluggish nature may become when thoroughly aroused. Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of the Prairie, by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. Whose party do the townsmen yet admit? King John. In order to preserve an even pace between the incidents of the tale, it becomes necessary to revert to such events as occurred during the ward of Ellen Wade. For the first few hours, the cares of the honest and warm-hearted girl were confined to the simple offices of satisfying the often repeated demands which her younger associates made on her time and patience, under the pretence of hunger, thirst, and all the other ceaseless wants of captious and inconsiderate childhood. She had seized a moment from their importunities to steal into the tent, where she was administering to the comforts of one far more deserving of her tenderness, when an outcry among the children recalled her to the duties she had momentarily forgotten. "See, Nelly, see!" exclaimed half a dozen eager voices. "Yonder are men, and Phoebe says they are Sioux Indians." Ellen turned her eyes in the direction in which so many arms were already extended, and to her consternation beheld several men advancing manifestly and swiftly in a straight line towards the rock. She counted 4, but was unable to make out anything concerning their characters, except that they were not any of those who of right were entitled to admission into the fortress. It was a fearful moment for Ellen. Looking around at the juvenile and frightened flock that pressed upon the skirts of her garments, she endeavoured to recall to her confused faculties some one of the many tales of female heroism with which the history of the western frontier abounded. In one, a stockade had been successfully defended by a single man, supported by 3 or 4 women, for days, against the assaults of 100 enemies. In another, the women alone had been able to protect the children, and the less valuable effects of their absent husbands. And third was not wanting, in which a solitary female had destroyed her sleeping captors, and given liberty not only to herself, but to a brood of helpless young. This was the case most nearly assimilated to the situation in which Ellen now found herself, and, with flushing cheeks and kindling eyes, the girl began to consider and to prepare her slender means of defence. She posted the larger girls at the little levers that were to cast the rocks of the assailants. The smaller were to be used more for show than any positive service they could perform, while, like any other leader, she reserved her own person, as the superintendent and encourager of the whole. When these dispositions were made, she endeavoured to await the issue with an air of composure, that she intended should inspire her assistants with the confidence necessary to ensure success. Although Ellen was vastly their superior in that spirit which emanates from moral qualities, she was by no means the equal of 2 eldest daughters of Esther in the important military property of insensibility to danger. Reared in the hardihood of a migrating life, on the skirts of society, where they had become familiarized to the sights and dangers of the wilderness, these girls promised fairly to become, at some future day, no less distinguished than their mother for daring, and for that singular mixture of good and evil, which, in a wider sphere of action, would probably have enabled the wife of the squatter to enroll her name among the remarkable females of her time. Esther had already on one occasion made good the log tenement of Ishmael against an inroad of savages, and on another she had been left for dead by her enemies, after a defence that, with a more civilized foe, would have entitled her to the honours of a liberal capitulation. These facts, and sundry others of a similar nature, had often been recapitulated with suitable exultation in the presence of her daughters, and the bosoms of the young Amazons were now strangely fluctuating between natural terror and the ambitious wish to do something that might render them worthy of being the children of such a mother. It appeared that the opportunity for distinction of this wild character was no longer to be denied them. The party of strangers was already within 100 rods of rock, either consulting their usual wary method of advancing, or admonished by the threatening attitudes of two figures, who had thrust forth the barrels of as many old muskets from behind the stone entrenchment. The newcomers halted, under favour of an inequality in the ground, where a growth of grass thicker than common offered the advantage of concealment. From this spot they reconnoitred the fortress for several anxious, and to Ellen interminable minutes. Then one advanced singly, and apparently more in the character of a herald than of an assailant. "Phoebe, do you fire?" and "No, Hetty, you?" were beginning to be heard between the half-frightened and yet eager daughters of the squatter, when Ellen probably saved the advancing stranger from some imminent harm, if from no greater danger, by exclaiming, "Lay down the muskets; it is Dr. Battius." Her subordinates so far complied as to withdraw their hands from the locks, though the threatening barrels still maintained the portentous levels. The naturalist, who had advanced with sufficient deliberation to note the smallest hostile demonstration of the garrison, now raised a white handkerchief on the end of his fusee, and came within speaking distance of the fortress. Then, assuming what he intended should be an imposing and dignified semblance of authority, he blustered forth, in a voice that might have been heard at much greater distance. "What ho! I summon ye all, in the name of the Confederacy of the United Sovereign States of North America, to submit yourselves to the laws." "Doctor or no doctor, he is an enemy, Nelly. Hear him, he talks of the law." "Stay till I hear his answer," said the nearly breathless Ellen, pushing aside the dangerous weapons which were again pointed in the direction of the shrinking person of the herald. "I admonish and forewarn ye all," continued the startled doctor, "that I am a peaceful citizen of the before named Confederacy, or to speak with greater accuracy, Union, a supporter of the social compact, and a lover of good order and amity." Then, perceiving that the danger was at least temporarily removed, he once more raised his voice to the hostile pitch. "I charge ye all, therefore, to submit to the laws." "I thought you were a friend," Ellen replied, "and that you travelled with my uncle, in virtue of an agreement." "It is void. I have been deceived in the very premises, and I hereby pronounce a certain compactum entered into and concluded between Ishmael Bush, squatter, and Obed Battius, M.D., to be incontinently null and of none effect. Nay, children, to be null is merely a negative property, and is fraught with no evil to your worthy parent, so lay aside the firearms, and listen to the admonitions of reason. I declare it vicious, null, abrogated. As for thee, Nelly, my feelings towards thee are not at all given to hostility. Therefore listen to that which I have to utter, nor turn away thine ears in the wantonness of security. Thou knowest the character of the man with whom thou dwellest, young woman, and thou knowest the danger of being found in evil company. Abandon, then, the trifling advantages of thy situation, and yield the rock peaceably to the will of those who accompany me. A legion, young woman, I do assure you, an invincible and powerful legion. Render, therefore, the effects of this lawless and wicked squatter. Nay, children, such disregard of human life is frightful in those who have so recently received the gift, in their own persons. Point those dangerous weapons aside, I entreat you, more for your own sakes than for mine. Hetty, hast thou forgotten who appeased thine anguish, when thy auricular nerves were tortured by the coals and damps of the naked earth? And thou, Phoebe, ungrateful, forgetful Phoebe, but for this very arm, which you would prostrate with an endless paralysis, thy incisors would still be giving thee pain and sorrow. Lay then aside thy weapons, and hearken to the advice of one who has always been thy friend. And now, young woman," still keeping a jealous eye on the muskets, which the girl had suffered to be diverted a little from their aim, "and now, young woman, for the last and therefore the most solemn asking, I demand of thee the surrender of this rock, without delay or resistance, in the joint names of power, of justice, and of the law," he would have added, but recollecting that this ominous word would again provoke the hostility of the squatter's children, he succeeded in swallowing it in good season, and concluded that with the less dangerous and more convertible term of reason. This extraordinary summons failed, however, of producing the desired effect. It proved utterly unintelligible to his young listeners, with the exception of the few offensive terms, already sufficiently distinguished, and though Ellen better comprehended the meaning of the herald, she appeared as little moved by his rhetoric as her companions. At those passages which he intended should be tender and affecting, the intelligent girl, though tortured by painful feelings, had even manifested a disposition to laugh, while to the threats she turned an utterly insensible ear.
"I know not the meaning of all you wish to say, Dr. Battius," she quietly replied, when he had ended, "but I am sure if it would teach me to betray my trust, it is what I ought not to hear. I caution you to attempt no violence, for let my wishes be what they may, you see I am surrounded by a force that can easily put me down, and you know, or ought to know, too well the temper of this family, to trifle in such a manner with any of its members, let them be of what sex or age they may."
"I am not entirely ignorant of human character," returned the naturalist, prudently receding a little from the position which he had, until now, stoutly maintained at the very base of the hill. "But here comes one who may know its secret windings still better than I." "Ellen! Ellen Wade!" cried Paul Hover, who had advanced to his elbow, without betraying any of that sensitiveness which had so manifestly discomposed the doctor. "I didn't expect to find an enemy in you."
"Nor shall you, when you ask that, which I can grant without treachery. You know that my uncle has trusted his family to my care, and shall I so far betray the trust as to let in his bitterest enemies to murder his children, perhaps, and to rob him of the little which the Indians have left?"
"Am I a murderer? Is this old man, this officer of the States," pointing to the trapper and his newly discovered friend, both of whom by this time stood at his side, "is either of these likely to do the things you name?"
"What is it then you ask of me?" said Ellen, wringing her hands in excessive doubt.
"The beast! Nothing more nor less than the squatter's hidden, ravenous, dangerous beast."
"Excellent young woman," commenced the young stranger, who had so lately joined himself to the party on the prairie, but his mouth was immediately stopped by a significant sign from the trapper, who whispered in his ear—
"Let the lad be our spokesman. Nature will work in the bosom of the child, and we shall gain our object in good time."
"The whole truth is out, Ellen," Paul continued, "and we have lined the squatter into his most secret misdoings. We have come to right the wrong, and to free the imprisoned. Now, if you are the girl of the true heart, as I have always believed, so far from throwing straws in our way, you will join in the general swarming, and leave old Ishmael and his hive to the bees of his own breed."
"I have sworn a solemn oath—"
"A compactum, which is entered into through ignorance or in duress, is null in the sight of all good moralists," cried the doctor.
"Hush, hush!" again the trapper whispered. "Leave it to all nature and the lad."
"I have sworn the sight and by the name of Him who is the founder and ruler of all that is good, whether it be in morals or in religion," Ellen continued, "neither to reveal the contents of that tent, nor to help its prisoner to escape. We are both solemnly, terribly sworn. Our lives perhaps have been the gift we receive for the promises. It is true you are masters of the secret, but not through any means of ours, nor do I know that I can justify myself for even being neutral, while you attempt to invade the dwelling of my uncle in this hostile manner."
"I can prove beyond the power of refutation," the naturalist eagerly explained, "by Paley, Berkeley, ay, even by the immortal Binkershoek, that a compactum, concluded, while one of the parties, be it state or be it an individual, is in durance—"
"You will ruffle the temper of the child with your abusive language," said the cautious trapper, "while the lad, if left to human feelings, will bring her down to the meekness of a fawn. Ah, you are like myself, little knowing in the nature of hidden kindness."
"Is this the only vow you have taken, Ellen?" Paul continued in a tone which, for the gay, light-hearted bee-hunter, sounded dolorous and reproachful. "Have you sworn only to this? Are the words which the squatter says to be as honey in your mouth, and all other promises like so much useless comb?" The paleness, which had taken possession of the usually cheerful countenance of Ellen, was hid in a bright glow, that was plainly visible, even at the distance at which she stood. She hesitated a moment, as if struggling to repress something very like resentment, before she answered with all her native spirit—
"I know not what right any one has to question me about oaths and promises, which can only concern her who has made them, if, indeed, any of the sort you mention have ever been made at all. I shall hold no further discourse with one who thinks so much of himself, and takes advice merely of his own feelings."
"Now, old trapper, do you hear that?" said the unsophisticated bee-hunter, turning abruptly to his aged friend. "The meanest insect that skims the heavens, when it has got its load, flies straight and honestly to its nest or hive, according to its kind. But the ways of a woman's mind are as knotty as a gnarled oak, and more crooked than the windings of the Mississippi."
"Nay, nay, child," said the trapper good-naturedly,
interfering in behalf of the offending Paul.
"You are to consider that youth is hasty, and not over given to thought. But then a promise is a promise, and not to be thrown aside and forgotten, like the hoofs and horns of a buffalo."
"I thank you for reminding me of my oath," said the still resentful Ellen, biting her pretty nether lip with vexation. "I might else have proved forgetful."
"Ah, female nature is awakened in her,"
said the old man, shaking his head in a manner to show how much he was disappointed in the result.
"but it manifests itself against the true spirit."
"Ellen," cried the young stranger, who until now had been an attentive listener to the parley, "since Ellen is the name by which you are known—"
"They often add it to another. I am sometimes called by the name of my father."
"Call her Nelly Wade at once," muttered Paul. "It is her rightful name, and I care not if she keeps it for ever."
"Wade, I should have added," continued the youth. "You will acknowledge that, though bound by no oath myself, I at least have known how to respect those of others. You are a witness yourself, and I have forborne to utter a single call, while I am certain it could reach those ears it would gladden so much. Permit me, then, to ascend the rock, singly. I promise a perfect indemnity to your kinsman, against any injury his effects may sustain."
Ellen seemed to hesitate, but catching a glimpse of Paul, who stood leaning proudly on his rifle, whistling, with an appearance of the utmost indifference, the air of a boding song, she recovered her recollection in time to answer— "I have been left captain of the rock, while my uncle and his sons hunt, and captain will I remain till he returns to receive back the charge." "This is wasting moments that will not soon return, and neglecting an opportunity that may never occur again," the young soldier gravely remarked. "The sun is beginning to fall already, and many minutes cannot elapse before the squatter and his savage brood will be returning to their huts." Dr. Battius cast a glance behind him, and took up the discourse by saying— "Perfection is always found in maturity, whether it be in the animal or in the intellectual world. Reflection is the mother of wisdom, and wisdom the parent of success. I propose that we retire to the discreet distance from this impregnable position, and there hold a convocation or council to deliberate on what manner we may sit down regularly before the place; or perhaps, by postponing the siege to another season, gain the aid of auxiliaries from the inhabited countries, and thus secure the dignity of the laws from any danger of a repulse." "A storm would be better," the soldier smilingly answered, measuring the height and scanning all its difficulties with a deliberate eye. "'Twould be but a broken arm or a bruised head at the worst." "Then have at it!" shouted the impetuous bee-hunter, making a spring that at once put him out of danger from shot, by carrying him beneath the projecting ledge on which the garrison was posted. "Now do your worst, young devils of a wicked breed. You have but a moment to work your mischief." "Paul! Rash Paul!" shrieked Ellen. "Another step and the rocks will crush you. They hang by but a thread, and these girls are ready and willing to let them fall." "Then drive the accursed swarm from the hive, for scale the rock I will, though I find it covered with hornets." "Let her if she dare!" tauntingly cried the eldest of the girls, brandishing a musket with a mien and resolution that would have done credit to her Amazonian dam. "I know you, Nelly Wade. You are with the lawyers in your heart, and if it come to a foot nigher, you shall have frontier punishment. Put in another pry, girls. In with it! I should like to see the man of them all that dare come up into the camp of Ishmael Bush without asking leave of his children. Stir not, Paul. For your life keep beneath the rock." Ellen was interrupted by the same bright vision, which on the preceding day had stayed another scarcely less portentous tumult, by exhibiting itself on the same giddy height where it was now seen. "In the name of Him, who commandeth all, I implore you to pause, both you, who so madly incur the risk, and you, who so rashly offer to take that which you never can return," said a voice, in a slightly foreign accent, that instantly drew all eyes upwards.
"Inez!" cried the officer, "do I again see you? Mine shall you now be, though a million devils were posted on this rock. Push up, brave woodsman, and give room for another." The sudden appearance of the figure from the tent had created a momentary stupor among the defendants of the rock, which might, with suitable forbearance, have been happily improved. But startled by the voice of Middleton, the surprised Phoebe discharged her musket at the female, scarcely knowing whether she aimed at the life of a mortal or at some being which belonged to another world. Ellen uttered a cry of horror, and then sprang after her alarmed or wounded friend, she knew not which, into the tent. During this moment of dangerous by-play, the sounds of a serious attack were very distinctly audible beneath. Paul had profited by the commotion over his head to change his place so far, as to make room for Middleton. The latter was followed by the naturalist, who, in a state of mental aberration, produced by the report of the musket, had instinctively rushed towards the rocks for cover. The trapper remained where he was last seen, an unmoved but close observer of the several proceedings. Though averse to enter into actual hostilities, the old man was, however, far from being useless. Favoured by his position, he was enabled to apprise his friends of the movements of those who plotted their destruction above, and to advise and control their advance accordingly. In the meantime, the children of Esther were true to the spirit they had inherited from their redoubtable mother. The instant they found themselves delivered from the presence of Ellen and her unknown companion, they bestowed an undivided attention on their more masculine and certainly more dangerous assailants, who by this time had made a complete lodgment among the crags of the citadel. The repeated summons to surrender, which Paul uttered in a voice that he intended should strike terror into the young bosoms, were as little heeded as were the calls of the trapper to abandon a resistance, which might prove fatal to some among them, without offering the smallest probability of eventual success. Encouraging each other to persevere, they poised the fragments of rocks, prepared the lighter missiles for immediate service, and thrust forward the barrels of the muskets with business-like air, and a coolness that would have done credit to men practised in warfare. "Keep under the ledge," said the trapper, pointing out to Paul the manner in which he should proceed. "Keep in your foot more, lad. Ah, you see the warning was not amiss. Had the stone struck it, the bees would have had the prairies to themselves. Now, namesake of my friend, Uncas, in name and spirit, now, if you have the activity of Le Cerf Agile, you may make a far leap to the right, and gain 20 feet without danger. Beware the bush, beware the bush. 'Twill prove a treacherous hold. Ah, he has done it. Safely and bravely has he done it. Your turn comes next, friend. That follows the fruits of nature. Push you to the left, and divide the attention of the children. Nay, girls, fire! My old ears are used to the whistling of lead, and little reason have I to prove a doe heart, with 80 years on my back." He shook his head with a melancholy smile, but without flinching in a muscle, as the bullet, which the exasperated Hetty fired, passed innocently at no great distance from the spot where he stood. "It is safer keeping in your track than dodging when a weak finger pulls the trigger," he continued. "But it is a solemn sight to witness how much human nature is inclined to evil in one so young. Well done, my man of beasts and plants. Another such leap, and you may laugh at all the squatter's bars and walls. The Doctor has got his temper up. I see it in his eye, and something good will come of him. Keep closer, man, keep closer." The trapper, though he was not deceived as to the state of Dr. Battius's mind, was, however, greatly in error as to the exciting cause. While imitating the movements of his companions, and toiling his way upwards with the utmost caution, and not without great inward tribulation, the eye of the naturalist had caught a glimpse of an unknown plant, a few yards above his head, and in a situation more than commonly exposed to the missiles which the girls were unceasingly hurling in the direction of the assailants. Forgetting, in an instant, everything but the glory of being the first to give this jewel to the catalogues of science, he sprang upward at the prize with the avidity with which the sparrow darts upon the butterfly. The rocks, which instantly came thundering down, announced that he was seen, and for a moment, while his form was concealed in the cloud of dust and fragments, which followed the furious descent, the trapper gave him up for lost. But the next instant he was seen safely seated in a cavity formed by some of the projecting stones, which had yielded to the shock,
holding triumphantly in his hand the captured stem, which he was already devouring with delighted, and certainly not unskilful, eyes. Paul profited by the opportunity. Turning his course, with the quickness of thought, he sprang to the post which Obed thus securely occupied, and unceremoniously making a footstool of his shoulder, as the latter stooped over his treasure, he bounded through the breach left by the fallen rock, and gained the level. He was followed by Middleton, who joined him in seizing and disarming the girls. In this manner a bloodless and complete victory was obtained over that citadel, which Ishmael had vainly flattered himself might prove impregnable. Chapter 14.